So basically what we have is every night you'll have just one chapter out of the Bible. So there'll be a process of about 8 books that we'll read through the 33 weeks. So we're starting in Genesis, and so a lot of the book that we're touching base with, especially I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, we'll talk about a lot of things in regards to origins. So what we are doing with that is that every day you're hopefully getting into the Word. So on the syllabus, it has a Bible chapter that is assigned. There will be a chapter or, forward through the introduction for a book. So you will know exactly every week the topic we're going to discuss. And so I'll put the topic there. We're also tonight going to do what's called a focus point. A focus point is a quick little 15 to 20 minute presentation, can take as long as 30 minutes. And what it is it's usually related to one of the books that we're reading, near the topic that we're reading. And what it comes with is the following week, we'll discuss it. We'll have a short presentation, and then you'll either do surveys of people that you know, so asking friends questions about what they believe, and we have the surveys, or you can bring in articles that are directed towards the topic that we're discussing, and we'll get more into that when we get into the second hour. So the first hour, so what we were supposed to read for today was Genesis 1 through 7, so because of the 7 days, and then the forward through the introduction on I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, and then the preface through chapter 1 on tactics. So since you guys are the ones there, so we're going to be directing a lot to you.
I have to tell you, we didn't get the tactics book yet.
Okay.
We did the reading in the other 2.
Cool. Then what we'll do is we'll focus on the other 2. And this is open to anyone. Hopefully everybody's read Genesis 1 through 7. And maybe there's a question that's kind of stuck in your head that you are unfamiliar with, or you have a question on. Or in regards to I Don't Have Enough Faith, the part that we read. Did you guys write down some of the questions that you had?
I didn't necessarily, no, I didn't.
Okay. Well, hey, I tend to work with a lot of people who are afraid to ask questions. So I've got a lot of questions that we can at least start discussion with. A couple of things, though, is I wanted to make sure, and this was brought up to me by a friend of mine, that a lot of the times I assume that people look up words when they don't know them. But sadly, that's not the case. Most of the time, either people will try to get them contextually, or they'll just kind of skip over them. So I just want to make sure that we know, first of all, some of the terms. So from this part of I Don't Have Enough Faith, apologetics. Is everybody familiar with what apologetics is? Okay. It's a subset of theology that is set up to defend the faith against differing worldviews. Okay, so it's actually a theological study. How about pluralism? Does everybody know what we mean by pluralism today?
I'm not sure.
Okay, no. Pluralism today is more seen as, and it's closely associated with tolerance. So pluralism is this accepting of everything almost of equal value. Most people will say as of equal value. So a pluralism or a pluralistic society is a society that allows a wide variety of different ideas. Now, is that a good thing?
Good and bad.
Well, yeah. Okay. It's a good thing because we shouldn't be coerced into believing or acting a story. With the caveat, there are things like murder. Other issues that, yes, people need to be coerced not to do. But when it comes to the general exchange of ideas or beliefs in regards to religious ideas, there should be a tolerance. But the problem that we get today is both tolerance and pluralism has a connotation or kind of an emotional and sometimes a denotation or a dictionary definition of meaning accepting of everything as of equal truth and value, which is a big problem. Because even on its face, it's absolutely false. But that is kind of the idea that we have. Tolerance, we talked about last week, used to be that we allowed people to hold their opinions. We treated them as image bearers, even if we totally thought their idea was wrong. We were able to discuss it. Nowadays, if you disagree, you're intolerant whether or not you've got a factual basis for why you disagree. It's become a very emotional issue. Do we know what we mean by objective and relative? Like objective truth and subjective truth or relative truth? Have you heard those terms before?
Well, like I said, objective truth is that it's true. It's based upon a fact.
Right. Yeah. And what I like to say with objective truth is it's based on the object. So it's actually outside of the subject or outside of our mind. So if I was saying, that the chairs in here are gray, that is either true or false, but it is an objective claim because it's in the object, okay? Subject is where it is our perception, it's how we perceive, okay? Give you an example, a good thing that we can give an example of subjective opinion between objective fact is, say you have diabetes, okay? If you have diabetes and your subjective opinion is that what you need is more ice cream, okay? That is your subjective opinion. Now, is that going to handle the objective fact of your disease? No, you need insulin for that. So a lot of the times now, objective and subjective does not necessarily mean true or false. It just means how we're referencing. Is it something that's outside of us in the world, or is it something that is just perception? Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. How about exclusive? Okay, and not necessarily the definition, but when we say exclusive, what do we mean by exclusive? What are some of the characteristics of exclusive?
Depends on which meaning you're talking about.
Okay.
Exclusive in the sense of unique.
Okay, unique.
Exclusive in the sense of excluding everything else.
Great, yeah. One thing that we get a lot of the times is that we'll get in this idea, and it talked about it in the book, that truth is exclusive. All truth is exclusive, meaning it does exclude its opposite. 2 + 2 = 4 excludes all other possibilities. And a lot of the times, what people will try to say in this culture with tolerance is to say that exclusiveness is wrong. Okay? But right there, they've made an exclusive claim. So we need to make sure that we understand what they're meaning when we talk about the word exclusive. Political correctness, I think we've all worked with, okay? It's been around long enough. How about the difference between opinion and argument? What's the difference between an opinion and an argument? And I'll tell you what, I read so many scientific, if you want to call them articles in newspapers and magazines that are truly opinion and not argument. So what is the difference?
An argument, you're talking about your opinion.
Well, an argument may have an opinion, but it also has something else.
Has more basis than an opinion.
Okay, basis in what?
In maybe facts on what you're talking about.
Okay, so an opinion is something that can be true or false, but it's not necessarily supported, or it's not in the way it's presented to you, it's not supported by evidence. Arguments are supported by evidence. And the one thing we need to do is when you read a lot of papers, you read a lot of arguments, quote unquote, from people, look to see whether or not they're supplying evidence or whether it is opinion. This is a great distinction. He talks about it in the opening chapters. Okay, so we talked about those. So basically, those were more of the words. Now, when you go through, and I don't know if you want to do this, if there are words in the reading that it has, or it seems to have somewhat of a technical note, you look it up in the dictionary and you're like, it still doesn't make sense in the context of the sentence. Write it down and we can talk about it. Because really what this class is for, calling it pursuing and defending a confident faith, is growing in our knowledge. And so a lot of it is based on discussion. I'll have a couple of points with each book that I'll bring up that I think are main points, but I'll usually only bring up 3. Okay? And again, we talked about it. My daughter-in-law, my new daughter-in-law, she's going into education. And see, she said, really, people, no matter what age, 3 points after that, they start losing. So, not saying you're dumb, not saying you're regular or anything like that, but we're going to stick with 3. We'll talk about other things, but we'll give 3 points to kind of take away. Okay? So write down words that maybe you're not sure of how they're being used. The other thing is thoughts and questions. I always read as if it's a conversation. Okay? I don't know if you guys do this. I can't lend my books to anybody because I annotate in all of them. I ask questions in all of them, even in my Kindle books. There's a great book, and we're actually going to talk. We're going to use a quote from the gentleman tonight, Mortimer Adler, considered one of the most erudite men who've ever lived. He actually edited the greatest works of the Western world, came to Christ late in life. But he wrote a book called How to Read a Book. And it's a fascinating book. If you ever have time, it will help you in reading different types of literature. There's a type of reading that is an interaction. And so what you do is when you read a book, it's as if you're having a verbal conversation with them, and you write your question. So they'll make a statement, and you're like, well, why do you believe that? Or what's the evidence for that? Because maybe they don't give it. And so it's an ongoing conversation. So in your books, I would highly recommend that you do that as well. Underline things, highlight things. I have a code. I'm just that way. Blue means it's a primary point. Then in my Kindle, then if I go to yellow, that means it is a point that is supporting, and it cascades down from there. So I can look through my books, and I can find major points for review. You know, it's just a great habit that you can get into. But write in your books. It's a conversation. So when you have a question, write down the question. If you have a disagreement, write down the disagreement. Now, I would highly recommend you do this primarily in Christian books. Do it in other books that you read. We're going to read actually some atheist books in this class. Why Evolution is True is actually written by Jerry Coyne, who is a very adamant atheist out of the University of Chicago. So we are actually going to write, well, how does he come to that? Why? It seems that he's missing things. So interact with the texts, okay?
By Charles Van Doren?
Say what?
The How to Read a Book was Charles Van Doren?
Well, it's also, isn't Mortimer Adler the co-author?
I just looked it up, and there's one called, what's the one you're talking about?
Let me send it to you, and I'll give that to everybody. But How to Read a Book is, and I think it was Mortimer Adler and Van Dorn, but I'll check it on it later.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just do the search.
Yeah, and so it's a fantastic book. Okay. Now, some of the thoughts. So why don't we go into questions? Did you have any other questions or things that came up in any of the reading? Nothing? Okay. Then what we'll do with this. He also gets into another. So let me ask you this. What do you think of the statement, proof is not a substitute for faith? What do you think of that comment? Yeah.
I think it's true in that faith still takes the Holy Spirit. You can't necessarily, I don't know how to word this, come to faith purely by scientific or proof or whatever. It still has to be the Holy Spirit working on it.
Okay. So what we're talking about, and one thing we'll get into this book is he actually, I don't want to say that he does a logical fallacy, but to a certain degree, he does what's called equivocation. He takes the word faith and he uses it differently than it is used biblically, and we'll get to that in a sec. But when he talks about proof is no substitute for faith, this gets down, and we won't get into the nitty-gritty, but there is a difference between an intellectual assent or an intellectual agreement or proving something with evidence and actually receiving and resting in that trust, if you want to call it. Now, we could get more technical and call it justification, that justification, the faith that is required, is something that is given by the Spirit. Now, he works through the Word, but the main point that I want to get through here, and that a lot of people talk about, is they are not opposite each other. We talked about this in the first lecture we had, that many people, we had the J.P. Moreland was discussing at a conference one time, and a lady got up and was mad at him because she said, the more you prove the Christian faith, the less room there is for faith. And he said, well, if that's the case, then God should destroy all evidences so that we can have more faith. And so what he was basically saying is they are not opposed. And in the Christian church, in a lot of places, they believe that faith is blind. Actually, we talked about a book by Peter Boghossian, which is called A Manual for Creating Atheists. He said the first thing you do is you tell the Christian, when you get into an engagement trying to deconvert them, you tell them that faith is blind trust in things that they know aren't so. Okay, basically going back a little bit. And the sad thing is most Christians believe that is the definition of faith, because it's against proof. It's not. So what he's trying to say is there are things that we can prove about our faith. There are things that we can validate, if we want to say. There are things that we can show to be true, historically, documentary, many different ways. But that does not necessarily mean, okay, that it's a substitute for faith, because faith is, especially and we're not going to get into the theological discussion, but faith is that conduit for which we receive salvation, a gift from God, okay? I like to use the word trust because faith a lot of the times has a lot of baggage, especially when you're talking with non-believers. But any questions on that or any thoughts on that? Did you have something, Joe?
So, I mean, the Bible says that faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction.
Evidence, things not seen. Yep.
So it's tempted to go, yeah, faith is a blind trust because you're not seeing it, but would you describe faith as, I have faith, I can't see the structure of this building, but I have faith that it's there, and this isn't going to collapse on me because I know that the building department would not have allowed it. So my faith is, may not see this, but my faith is in something greater than this building. Is that?
In that sense, it would be a reasonable trust.
Right. So
yes.
You say that's how it is, so that our faith is, we may not be able to see something, but our faith is in something greater than what we can see. And there's lots of evidence around
our trust. Yes, and we'll get into that. We'll actually talk about what is the standard for proof. What is, and will we be able to answer all questions? Can we answer everything that comes against the Christian faith? No. So what we're looking at is, do we have a preponderance that gives us the reasonability that even if we can't answer some of those outlying questions, we can trust the Scripture, because where we can see that it's true, it is true. It's a reasonable trust. Yeah. And so the way he uses the term in the book is he uses it as a gap in knowledge, which before I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, I had never heard really that definition of faith as a gap in knowledge. It almost accedes to a little degree to what atheists would say we're doing, almost a God of the gaps. So, but that's the way they present it in the book. And the reason he does it that way in the introduction is because he's trying to show that if we take the evidence, because again, the title of the book is I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. If we take the evidence that we have that he is going to present through a 12-step process. We're all in, an AA meeting now. But we're going to go through a 12-step process to get to at least an intellectual validation of what the faith is. What he's saying is if we put side by side the Christian evidences and the atheistic or the naturalistic evidences, then at the point of where we could say answering all questions, say there is a line, as like if we were looking at a football field and at the 100-yard line, if you could get to the 100-yard line, all your questions would be answered. Okay, that would give you the sufficient knowledge. Well, atheism gets you to the 30-yard line. Christianity gets you to the 90th yard line, or 10 yards from scoring on the other side. He is putting then faith is the distance to that point of knowledge. Does that make sense to everybody? And so he's saying that it takes more faith. There's a larger gap between the evidences that atheism or naturalism offers, or Christianity offers, and answering the questions that we all have. Why are we here? Why are things important? Meaning, morality, destiny, identity, those kind of questions. Does that make sense?
Yeah, do you think atheists, though, think that they go to the 100-yard line?
No, most will say there are unknowable things. Yeah, I have not met an atheist, and even your hardcore atheists now are saying that they're hard agnostics, like Richard Dawkins, because pure atheism is unprovable. So they're backing off a little, and they'll say they're unknowns, but the main things that we're going to compare those unknowns to are things like the design of the universe, why we have emotions. Is there an immaterial self? Why is there consciousness? Why do we have things like love? Why do we crave meaning? Why is purpose so important for living, that once you lose purpose and meaning, death is not far away. So those are the kind of things that we're talking about. So if you want to call them the existential or the questions that we are asking, those are kind of the goalposts. Does that make sense to everybody? So that's why he calls it, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, because he's saying is, if we are looking at the worldviews and how they answer reality as it is around us, Christianity is so far closer to answering most of the questions than naturalism is. And so it takes more faith or trust because of the gap than it does, okay? So that's kind of the premise of his book, and that's what we'll go through. Again, it's 12 chapters. Yeah, Brian.
I was just along those lines. It seems to me in conversation with people that atheists, that they tend to demand that we get basically 100 yards as Christians.
Right. Yes.
Which is unfair,
Yes.
to demand that.
Yeah, and so we need to look at, and I think a lot of the times is bringing analogies. There was an atheist cafe that a gentleman I know that goes in and he videotapes in. And he was asking one individual, and he said, so, what would be sufficient evidence, and this is a great question, what would be sufficient evidence for you to change your mind on this subject, that God exists? And this gentleman said, well, and I'm paraphrasing, I can't remember word for word the conversation, but he basically said, well, he said, I wouldn't trust my own eyes if I saw, God appearing. And he says, I maybe, hallucinating or something. I wouldn't believe a small group. He says, if 5 million people saw it at the same time, that would be sufficient. And the gentleman turned it back around and he said, you cannot prove anything at all then. There's not an incident that 5 million people are observing at the same time. So you have given an unreasonable, because you can't even prove that George Washington was the first president. You can't prove anything that we know from history. So don't you think that's a little unreasonable? And you bring it back, because they do. They want more proof than they do for average, everyday things. Yeah, so there's a good point. Any other questions so far? Okay. So he really gets into it. We'll get into chapter 1. Truth is the casualty of both. Most naturalists will not admit this, but truth is a casualty of naturalism, because if all there is event after event of atoms colliding and things happening, there really isn't truth. There just is what is. So you lose truth. We'll get more into this. But postmodernism as well gets rid of truth. So whether or not you go, which are the two main routes that he'll talk about in the book, if you go the postmodern route or if you go the naturalism route, you actually end up losing truth. But truth is of ultimate importance, and we know this. You cannot deny truth, okay? And we'll get into that more into chapter 1. But let me really quick, the 3 points that I want to make sure, and then we'll go through some of the questions, okay? And if you guys do this, I don't know, how many of you journal or write notes? I think it's a great idea. Books that I read and that. So, the first thing that I really think in the forward through the introduction of I Don't Have Enough Faith is many truth claims, even religious, okay, can be investigated and their plausibility determined. What I'm meaning here is that claims can be tested. okay? And they need to be looked at and tested. And so we're going to learn throughout this book that we can evaluate the claims of people that you come across. So whether he's a Buddhist or a Hindu or a naturalist, we can ask them what they claim to be true. And we can see if we can validate, falsify, or prove any of their points. Usually the idea of something is unfalsifiable, it's usually not true, okay? If it cannot be shown to be false. Christianity is one of those that is a historic faith, one of the only, that it can actually be shown to be false. If we can show that the tomb of Christ was not empty, then as Paul says, our faith is in vain. So one of the main points that I want you to know is when people talk about religious truths, we need to test them. We are in a culture and in a society today that believes that ideas about religion are in what we would call the feeling realm or the imaginative realm. It's separated from the cold, hard facts of the world. So you can believe anything you want. Is that making sense to everybody?
So is that
Yeah, go for it.
like in Scientology, like they say, you know, a bunch of souls are put into DC-8s, and well, like say, since you can't prove that this happened
Right.
somewhere, that's it can't be considered false. It's not falsifiable, so therefore it's probably not true.
Right. And it's a general rule to go by. What we can do is if you say you have a religion like Scientology where none of it can actually be examined and shown to be true or false, you really have pure subjectivity because there is nothing objective that you can verify about it. So, yeah, now, are there certain doctrines, even within Christianity, that are pure doctrine? Can I prove the Trinity? No. So all religions probably, will have points that you have to take as pure doctrine that are revealed truth, okay? But there are other aspects that you should be able to evaluate and look at and see if it relates to life, see if it answers the questions of life. Because anything is possible, but is it probable? Is it reasonable? And we need to use that reasonableness to come to.
So
yeah.
The ancients, I don't remember what culture, who used to say that the earth was on the back of a giant turtle.
Right.
Well, we can, not only is that falsifiable, but we can see that it's false. So
Yes.
That's different than Scientology.
Yes.
Where maybe it happened, but you can't prove it false, so it becomes pretty darn false.
Yeah. Well, and there are also other aspects that you can, as we get farther on, because, and it's been a while since I've studied Scientology, but it's interesting that levels of development correspond to the amount of money you can give. So there are certain things that can raise doubts that, well, you know, if it's knowledge or if it's certain things that we're acquiring, money doesn't correlate to that. So, I mean, we can do and make some reasonable arguments to show that even though they're not falsifiable, purely falsifiable, we can show that it seems unreasonable. Yep. So this is, and really this whole course, first is going to hopefully help encourage you to think deeply about your faith and other things, but to question, because we need to be able to defend and know what we believe and why we believe it. Okay, so they can be determined. Okay, now, another thing that I wanted to bring out, okay? Things are based on probability. What do I mean by that? Most proof is based on probability. Anybody want to take a stab at that? He talked about it a little bit in the book.
Likeliness?
Okay, the likeliness. Why are most things proven by probability or the likelihood of it being true? Does anybody want to take a stab?
Statistically?
Well, statistics, but how many things? There are very few things that can be proven 100%. Okay, and that's what he's trying to get to. Very few things in our life. Things can be true by definition. A bachelor is an unmarried male. You know, that is true by definition. You can have pure mathematic proofs. 2 + 2 = 4. Okay? You can have proofs, absolute proofs in logic. But when it comes to the world around us, it's based on probability, the likelihood of something happening. So if there is a probability, can we be wrong? Oh, absolutely. So what he then goes into, and we kind of discussed it, is that likelihood of being wrong is that gap in faith, or is that that what he represents as faith, that gap. So we need to start thinking probabilistically, okay? That means when we start talking, like Brian brought up, we should discuss with people and help them to understand what standards of proof are, what those possibilities are, how we can determine the likelihood or the reasonableness of something. Okay? Yeah, Joe.
Would this be like Occam's razor?
Yes, to a certain degree, it would be Occam's razor, and Occam's razor usually is the simplest explanation is usually the correct if you don't have ad hoc, but it's basically a way of looking at things and trying to determine. Hopefully what we're going to do throughout the course of this is the probability is going to be based on evidence. We're going to look at evidential, both philosophical evidence, we're going to be looking at scientific evidence, we're going to be looking at manuscript evidence, we're going to be looking at archaeological evidence, and then we're actually going to have cumulative, what we would call a cumulative case, which looks at the several areas of evidence. And so that is what increases the probability of the biblical account being true to reality and atheism or naturalism being shown not to be true to reality. Okay? Because we want to believe what is true to reality. Okay? What I'll probably do, we won't talk about tactics because no one's read it in here. Okay? So we'll skip on that. Okay? One thing I want to tell you too is he talks about it in the book, but it also comes up a lot. If Christianity is so true to reality and the evidence is so strong, why don't most people believe? Why? Because we think that, especially in a scientific age, we think that, well, if you just have the right evidence, everyone kind of follows along. Yeah.
I think that's because then they have to answer to it.
Yeah.
They have to answer to God when it's all said and done, and adults especially don't like, you don't have to answer to somebody. You're an adult, you should, make your own rules or whatever.
That's exactly right. Do you know what? He refers to that in the book. He gives a term for it. Do you remember the term? No? Okay, no problem.
Volition?
Volitional. Volition is an act of will. So really, he talks about, and other authors have brought this up as well, there are three reasons that people usually will deny the faith. One is for intellectual reasons. Maybe they do have answers that either have not been answered or they don't think have been answered adequately, or, it is. So, are there contradictions in the Bible? When they talk about intellectually engaging it, could it have been written by humans? Can God, work that way? Are they reliable? Okay, are the scriptures reliable? Does evolution and the Big Bang, if that is what happened, then we have a lot of problems with Genesis. Those would be intellectual questions. The next that you brought up was volitional. That is more of the idea that you don't want it to be true. It's actually interesting. One of the quotes that he talks about is one by Friedrich Nietzsche, that he says, if one were to prove this God of the Christians to us, we would even less be able to believe in him. And the reason he is saying that is because of a volitional reason, because we get what we would call the power of the will, or the Übermensch from Nietzsche. And so his was, and he was definitely saying, he says, even if you prove it and you show more and more that he is my judge, I will reject him because my will not allow it. Okay? What is the third reason? Do you guys remember? Emotional. So a lot of this, and actually I have found quite a few fundamentalists that have gone to atheists, that this has been the primary reason, is the problem of pain. Okay? There's even a book by Bart Ehrman that he goes through, and he explains it, and he says, God's problem is what it's called. And really, he lost faith in the God of the Bible because of the problem of pain. Not intellectually as much. Now, he gives intellectual reasons, but it's more emotional. Darwin when he started thinking of how, I think it was the wasp. I can't remember the particular wasp, but it would lay its eggs inside of a spider. And then when the eggs hatched, they would eat the spider from the inside out. And he, in a sense, thought, how could a God create a world where this kind of parasitic activity takes place? Okay? Now, we could go into intellectual answers for that, but it was an emotional thing. Or maybe someone that they love died. How could God take them away? Or what Luther called the hiddenness of God, and many other reformers referred to it in different terms. But basically that in the moment of pain, the Job experience, that God seems to be silent. So those are emotional reasons. So just because, and we used to, and I don't know if I still have and I may be, the reformers, and I don't know if we get into it in the book or not, but they broke faith, or they broke biblical faith into three areas. The first one was what was called notitia. Notitia was the information. So we could call this the intellectual aspect to a certain degree. You have to know who Jesus is to believe in Jesus. You have to know what the Bible says to be a biblical Christian. You need the information. Then there was what was called a sensus. A sensus was you assent that it is true, or you agree that possibly it is true. We think of James, when James says, the demons believe and tremble, but are they saved? No, they are not. They have an assensus, they assent to the truth. Fiducia, and we think of this today as fiduciary capacity, like a bank that has taken the responsibility of money or certain items for another person. And a lot of the times they would represent fiducia is, you know what a chair is, you believe a chair can hold you, but faith is where you actually act upon that and you sit in the chair. Okay? And so they would break it up into those specific areas. And so when it comes to faith, I only bring this in is because it's not just intellectual reasons why people deny the faith. We know it. I think you're right. I think most people, if you break it down, I even knew of a pastor that when somebody would come in and they were having trouble with the faith, you know, and this may be a little crass for some, but the first thing he would say, are you sleeping with your girlfriend? He would bring up a point of willful disagreement because their lifestyle does not match what, if it is true, they need to do. Okay? So, very good point. Okay? So really, religious truth claims can be validated or invalidated. Truth claims of any category, we should be looking for evidence, okay? There are multiple reasons why people will not become a Christian, even if we have all the evidence in the world and we can prove things, whether scientifically, philosophically, and that since most truth is based on probability, all claims require some amount of faith. Now remember, their definition of faith that they use in this book, in some ways, is a gap in belief. A gap in what you believe or what you know and what you hold to be true. And everybody understands that? Mm-hmm. Okay. So, put forth some questions and see. What do you guys think of the analogy of a worldview as a box top, of a puzzle? What did you guys think of that analogy?
That was very good. You got a definite picture of, you don't have that box top puzzle or a box top of the puzzle. It's really, really, really hard to make it out of the puzzle.
Oh yeah. Has anybody in here ever done one of those double-sided? There's one, it's 3,000 pieces, it's a double-sided Dalmatian. Dude, I'd shoot myself before I tried that. there's no way. Or you can order boxes with no box top. You have no idea what the picture is. and you can put it together. I like it for a number of reasons, and just for those who haven't read the book, what he does is he says basically a worldview, when we're trying to encapsulate what reality is, a worldview is like a box top. It is your guiding principle that helps you put the puzzle pieces of life together. It gives you an orderly way of understanding the reality or the thing that you're trying to piece together. Because all of us will admit it's a broken world. It's a broken world. We live in a world where most of the time the decisions is choosing the lesser evil because it is so broken. That how do we arrange that? How do we understand it? And so I also like the analogy too, because you can, when we're talking about the completeness of the picture, you can get a picture of, say, Toronto. You know, there's certain features in Toronto, or St. Louis with the arch, or you name the city. And you could probably be missing a large percentage of the puzzle and still be able to tell what it is for the pieces that you have, okay? Very few. G.K. Chesterton used to say when he compared, in his book Orthodoxy, when he compared the Christian worldview with the atheist worldview, what he used to say is, he said in the Christian worldview, he said you have the primary questions, all the primary questions of life answered. He said you have some peripheral things that we're not sure about. He said, but when it comes to what we are as humans, he said the essential questions naturalism cannot answer. It answers a few periphery questions. And so that's really, when we think about the box top, it's a good way, Occam's razor, of evaluating who has a better picture, who has more pieces. That. What are some other analogies you guys can think of that would fit kind of a box topper or a way of a worldview and reality? Maybe like glasses. You know, you always hear about, you know, the glasses you wear. If you have correct glasses that can correct your view, you know, that is something. You know, just something to think about. I know it is late, and it is a Tuesday. So, any other questions on what we've just talked about so far? No? Okay. Let me ask you some question. Does only science reveal truth? Okay. What are other ways that we understand or know truth?
Experience.
Experience is the big one. Most of what we experience, you know, and especially in a, you know, I give this example in a marriage relationship, you know, you don't scientifically test your wife. You know her experientially. You know her through interacting. What are other ways that maybe we know things? Okay, we know things scientifically. How else do we learn or know things?
By seeing.
Okay,
Right.
so by our senses, you know, we could encapsulate that with kind of the five senses, you know, in scientific method. How about by analogy? We can relate by analogy. We learn things by analogy. Okay, concepts. There's many ways of knowing. We won't get into all these details. But really, what scientists, or scientism, I should say, not scientists, but scientism will try to say is there's only one way of true knowledge. But we know that is not true. I mean, it's evidently and it's patently false. And we can come across, unless you are going to discount your inner thoughts, discount your experiences, discount, which then it's not true to life. It's not true to the life that we live, okay? And, okay. We're gonna get to the five most, we'll get to that in a second. Okay. What do you guys think? When is enough information reached to make a reasonable conclusion? What do you guys think the standard of proof should be? How convinced should you be? You know, if you want to think of the legal system, you know, there's different standards of proof. If you are going to base your entire life on it, what degree of certainty, or, you know, do you think that is reasonable? Do you think it's just a preponderance of truth? You're a little over 50%, kind of like Pascal's wager. Do you think it's a preponderance of truth? We're going more 60, 70%. Is it beyond a reasonable doubt? 95%. What do you think is good?
I don't think it can technically be measured by percentage.
Right.
The reason why I say that is because some things you might not need as much proof to believe it without a reasonable doubt. And other things you might think, I need more information. So something that you may believe without a reasonable doubt might be at quote unquote 60%. And something else you have to know like 100%
Right.
to say, this is enough for me. I think that would be each individual person and the situation.
Okay.
Have a true answer for something like that.
Well, when it comes to giving your life to a belief system like Christianity that tells you to take up your cross and follow Him, to deny yourself, to do certain things that are not in our nature to do, how much proof do you think, on an average, what do you think is reasonable for somebody to ask? So just in faith questions, I'm not talking about other areas, but I'm like, if you're totally realigning your life, what are some thoughts?
What are the consequences if you don't?
Okay?
Yeah.
And that was Pascal's wager. Not necessarily an item of proof, but he said, if I die and Christianity wasn't true, I lived a good life, I cared for people, I did this, and I'm not going to know about it. If atheists don't believe Christianity is true, and it is, then they've lost everything. And so he kind of looked at it. So some people will do that as a way of evaluating. If they're like at the 50-50 mark, they'll say, okay, which one? And I think that's reasonable. And people may go either way. Well, I think that it is okay to ask for beyond a reasonable doubt. I do think that if I am trying to show somebody that they need to change their entire lifestyle, change their beliefs, change how they view their worldview, I think it's okay for them to ask legitimate questions, hard questions, that we should be able to answer. Now, are we going to be able to answer every question? No. And it is going to come down to a comparison, similar to what they're trying to do in this book, is saying, hey, when we lay all the evidence out, let's talk about the evidence. When we lay it out, and if you're standing with naturalism and I'm standing with Christianity, I'm 10 feet from the goal, you're 70. That kind of idea. So I think that they do have the right to ask. I think they need to be reasonable and not ask for 5 million people all at once to view the thing and then, I think, and those are conversations we have. But when an atheist asks us for questions and is confronting us with questions, don't feel on guard. They may, and you may have to test the waters, but they may legitimately just want answers. And really, they have the right to ask. Would you guys agree with that?
Yes.
Yeah. I think sometimes the minute somebody starts asking questions, we get defensive that they are attacking our faith. But maybe, as Paul tells us in Philippians, to put the best construction on it, and why don't we think that maybe God is tugging on their heart and they need some answers and not be defensive? That's where knowledge comes in. And we'll talk about this in the tactics book. We'll move it to next week. But with that taking place, you become more confident when you are more knowledgeable. And we become less defensive when we are more knowledgeable. Because not every little whim is going to throw us off our base. We feel secure. Yes?
Also, even if they are attacking us, this is God's way of using us to make us stronger. I don't know the answer to that. You figure out the answer, and then now the next time you're ready.
Yeah.
Because if nothing ever, you never build muscle without breaking it down.
No, you never. And that's exactly right as well. I like that because we also, this may be the only time they come, and if they attack you and you are caring towards them, that will leave an impression. Man, I was a jerk to that Christian, and he just was chill about it. He tried to answer my questions. He thought, can I get your name and number and I can give you a call because these are great questions. I just don't have the answers to them right now. Don't be afraid to say you don't have the answer. Okay? Especially today, it's people are looking for authentic answers. The people will just engage. Yes?
Yeah, we actually talked to one young man today, and he believed that science will eventually someday solve it. You know, we'll eventually get to the truth with science. But I don't know, I guess maybe I struggled a little bit with telling them that there are gaps for Christians and for atheists, that it's okay to still lean towards Christianity, even though there's, simply because there are gaps in the evidence, you know, that they can't explain it naturalistically. But people don't want to accept that it's okay to lean towards a creator God. They feel like they have to prove everything.
I really think that, and this goes back, if I'm understanding you correctly, an approach is that really any worldview needs to be a cumulative approach. You need, if we're talking about a puzzle again, you need enough that you can reasonably formulate what it is. Okay? And it gives you the answers. And again, you can tell what a picture is. You can validate a worldview and have little pieces here and there that don't fit perfectly, or we don't have answers for. But it is reasonable, okay, to believe that based on the whole composition of the picture. Is that making sense to everybody? Okay.
And right now, I would say that some of the evidence is really pointing to a creator God. But his viewpoint, his worldview is, no, it doesn't point to God. We will eventually solve it.
Okay. Well, and without getting too technical, there are certain questions, and we'll get into this later, there are certain questions that science can never answer. And sometimes we have to bring that up with people. One of those, I use the quip, and I got it, I think, from Brett. But basically, it's science can tell us how to kill grandma, but science can never tell us if it's right to kill grandma. It's a question that's outside of its realm of answering. So when it comes to certain questions, it depends on, when you're talking to people, that science will eventually answer all questions. Then I probably would kick back, and this will get into our book, Tactics. You guys, that is a great book. It actually tells you how to engage, it's not giving you the content of the faith, it's giving you how do you engage. And one of the best ways, and we see our Savior doing this, is through questions, is having people evaluate through asking them questions. So in this point, I would probably say, well, what are some of the things that you believe that are not answered today by science that will be answered? And then he may come up with the things, and then probably at that time, I would interject. Then I say, is science ever going to become, or be able to give us an explanation of, you know, and come up with an idea that prods him to know, you know, morality. Is it ever going to give us an absolute answer for morality? Is it capable of doing that? Then I would probably move into the realm of saying, do you believe morality exists? I don't care if you're saying it's relative or subjective right now, but does it exist? Is it an actuality? And we'll learn that through the course of the year. But the books, again, we're going to stop there. We're going to take a break, okay? Hopefully, and I know with a lot of people it's really busy, try to interact with your book as much as you can. And I know a lot of you, it's the first time here, so you didn't have time to read. But interact with the book. Highlight, disagree with the book, play devil's advocate, ask for evidence, you know, or compliment, also saying, hey, that's a good point, or whatever. That's the way we can interact, have a dialogue with the author. Now, the author isn't here, so I will do my best to answer some of those questions, maybe from their perspective, if the way I perceive it, and also if I differ a little bit. But so really, it was just the introduction. Understand, you know, the ideas of a worldview being like a top for a puzzle box. Think about that, kind of, you know, ponder that through the week. Think that, you know, religious claims are truth claims, and truth claims can be validated. Also know that all truth claims have a measure in their definition of faith being a gap between what they believe and what they know to be true, okay? Then, the last thing that he wanted to talk about is that, no, maybe when you talk to people, because this is also a good act as a friend. Sometimes if somebody comes up to you and they are distraught and they're asking you questions about evil in the world, they may not be looking for intellectual answers. They may be looking for comfort because it's an emotional doubt that they're having. And so when we can look to see how people are struggling, maybe it's a volitional doubt, maybe it is an intellectual, okay? Because we need to address the doubts that they have in the manner that they have them. Okay? Now, we hopefully always come back to the intellectual proof of truth, but still, we may have to start with them somewhere else. So those are kind of takeaways from where we start. One thing I want to say, the reason I use I don't have enough faith to be an atheist is I like its progression. Really, everyone you come across is going to be somewhere on the spectrum from pure skepticism, believing there is no truth, all the way to the point where they believe the Bible is the Word of God, but maybe they don't believe certain aspects about the historicity of the Bible. So everywhere along this process, you can start there and then move on, okay? So if you have a pure skeptic, you can start with them and helping them to understand that truth is undeniable and that the opposite of true is false. We have the law of non-contradiction. Then we have proofs for God, and we keep moving along that line from doubt to certainty, okay? Now, I will, in many points, disagree with the book, especially when it comes to items of creation. But there's also a way of arguing where you use their evidence and you step inside their worldview and show that their own worldview comes to wrong conclusions. So I can show them that I don't think the evidence supports what they believe about certain parts of creation. But if I want to, I can argue that way, but I can also argue agreeing with them and say, okay, I'll give that to you, but I'm going to show you also fail that route. So actually, we can use both arguments, okay? There's a lot of different ways to answer that. One of the things that and it depends on, again, how they're asking the question, because a lot of the times it's emotional. But if the person is looking for an intellectual answer, usually there's different arguments. One of the most common is what is called the free will, okay, where God allows us to reject him. And you cannot really coerce love. Love is not something that is forced upon. You have to be able to make a choice. And since there is a choice between loving and not loving, it's a gamble. But God was willing to do that. Now, with that being said, the world is broken because of us. The world is broken because God allows our decisions in many places to stand. Now, you can go into it to show that God stepped into the creation to experience the pain and the suffering, that he didn't leave it without solution. So it depends on if they're looking for immediate solution or if they have perspective. There's a lot of different factors. But another factor is that really, and this gets more into the philosophical side, you really can't have the problem of evil without the existence of a transcendent God. So really, you run into problems when you take God out of the equation. First, when you take God out of the equation, it doesn't solve anything. It makes it worse. We will get into that. I actually do a talk, a book you may be interested. It's one of my favorite books. It is a little difficult at times, but it's called Theodicy of Love. Theodicy is the discipline of defense of God in the face of pain and evil. It's a sub-discipline of apologetics. And so they're called theodicies. Now, there are some great books out there that go from the very logical to where you have deductive arguments showing that, you can't deny it. For those that are hyper-intellectual, you have more books that are addressing the emotional side. Really, it's one of those questions that you have to see. It's an individual thing that you're interacting with that person. But Theodicy of Love is a great book. And I can give you, we can talk about it more later as well. But that is probably the number one question besides evolution that is the reason given for people leaving the faith, is the problem of pain and the supremacy of evolution and science. Those are two major reasons.
And
So.
I know that some people use, well, this person was such a good person, there's no reason that they should go through pain. And in times that I've seen that, it's when it's a loved one that is sick or hurting or does pass away. If that was, quote unquote, the reasoning of it, we're not perfect. None of us are perfect, so that is why God allowed us to go through the pain, per se, as they say. They see this person as like almost perfect, but we're not.
No, we've lost.
That they're using in a sense.
We've lost the gravity of sin. We've lost the true identity that we have without Christ. We've changed the word sin into, I made a mistake, my bad, whatever you want to say. We've lost the gravity because we lost the comparison. Yeah, and the comparison is not between me and so-and-so. It's between me and God. That's the holiness that I'm held accountable to. And if we're looking on the scale of me and God, I'm closer to Hitler than Mother Teresa. I mean, in the sense of our depravity. And so that's a huge thing that has been lost in our culture, is the true understanding of the rebellion that we have against God. Yeah, because we're not good. And a lot of the times when it comes to the problem of evil, and people will say, well, God needs to stop all evil, then I usually turn it to them personally. I say, let me ask you a couple of questions. If God is, you have to step into my worldview because you're trying to deny my God. So if you want to have this argument and you say God needed to stop this, God needs to stop all sin, let me ask you a couple of questions. And I usually paint a scenario. And I usually say, have you done certain things today? How do you want God, should God stop you in that action as well? And you bring it out of the abstract to the personal. And then they see, well, if God stops all sin, I'm in a bucket, I'm in a world of hurt because he wouldn't be happy with anything I'm doing.
And a lot of people see sin as levels of sin, like murder is the worst, and a little lie is least, but in God's eyes, sin is sin.
Well, in God's eyes, sin is sin when it comes to separation. In God's eyes, not all sins are the same. Murder is worse than other things. So we just need to make sure we have that. So when it comes to, I get this a lot when it comes to different sexual sins, that we seem to have a variation of sins that are worse. Like some are supposedly unforgivable, some are not so bad. But we need to understand that they're on the same level in the separation from God. And the person who is doing something, what the Bible would call fornication is the same as a homosexual act when it comes to a violation against God's will. So there's a lot of things that we would need to go into, but you're right. We need to make sure they understand all sin separates. That's the main point. All right. So what we're going to do here is once every 2 weeks, we're going to do what is called a focus point apologetic. And this we will hit a particular point. We'll hit the problem of evil. We'll hit the philosophical foundation of science to show that science itself is built on philosophy. And so it can't even make its own claims. We'll get into things like that. We'll talk about genocide. Is God a genocidal maniac? We'll talk about gender issues. but they'll be more focused, and they'll deal with what we're dealing with at the time in the other books that we're reading. So basically this one, the first part of it, these are what are called, I set them up as focus point apologetics. And so they're not going to be, my last program, I have a lot of animations, things moving in and out, and trying to keep people focused. These are just line by line. These are just hitting points. We're going to talk about them. And then what you're going to do is then either there's a survey based on the PowerPoint topic, and so you will talk to friends or relatives, or if you want to go down and talk to people on the street, you can. I take kids to do that, to find out what people truly believe and about these topics. Or if that's a little scary to you, you can just bring in articles that we can discuss that deal with the issue that we're dealing with, okay? And so there's a list in your syllabus of every single week and every single topic and the dates that the surveys are due or your articles are due. So the syllabus actually outlines everything. So if you're afraid where we are, it has the weeks. So you should be good on that. I think I put also the date. Okay, so not just week, but I put the date as well. Okay, so this is focus point apologetics. One of the things that they talked about, and I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, is there are 5 questions that all worldviews have to have some kind of an answer for. Maybe adequate, it may be inadequate, but they do need to address it because of the importance and the value that it has in our human existence, of what we call human life, okay? So, yeah, they could say, oh, we don't need to answer that. Well, that's for you to evaluate whether or not that's sufficient. I would say these 5 questions need to be answered by all worldviews, okay? We're also going to get into what are called 5 principles in worldview discussions. This is based on a book that we'll talk about called Finding Truth by Nancy Pearcey, and it actually comes out of Romans 1 and 2. I believe it's a very biblical way of showing the faultiness in worldviews that reduce the world to an aspect of the world. So like naturalism, takes the supernatural out and reduces it to just natural things. Well, when you reduce something, there's going to be things that no longer fit into the box. And we're going to see those, and it'll help us to evaluate. We'll get more and more into that. Okay, so 5 questions and 5 principles in worldview discussions. First thing I want to start with is, this is the quote by Mortimer Adler. Mortimer Adler said there's more implications that flow from the subject of God than from any other subject. This is when he was asked why, when he was doing some editing on, I can't remember which encyclopedia said it was, but he was asked, why is the section on God so long? And this was part of his response, as he said, because the implications and the bearing it has on everything is so huge, okay? And it's interesting because really that question, there either is a God or there isn't a God. It's what we call the law of the unexcluded, or the law of the excluded middle. It either is or it is not. There's no half God out there, or, whatever. There either is or there isn't. And the ramifications, or the outflow, if you want to call it, on all other areas of life are hugely affected by that one topic, okay? So this is where we start from. And that's why when you do the surveys, the first question that we ask on our survey is, do you believe in God or a higher power? And it asks for other information as well. But when we look about it, now these are the 5 points. These come from other areas. They're in different forms. Different books have them. This is not just I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. This was one of the first places when I originally read, when I started thinking about this. So these are questions that all worldviews must address, okay? And how they answer it, you're going to find out, gives you opportunity when we get through the 5 principles that you can start showing the problems with their worldview. Very simply, very easily, okay? Now, not all of them are going to be simple and easy as discussions progress, okay? The first one is the question of origin. All worldviews have to give an account why there is something rather than nothing, okay? Why is there anything at all? something has to have the property of eternality. Because if there was a time in the past there was nothing, there would be nothing today. So there needs to be something that is timeless. Now, how you conceptualize that could be different, but there has to be something. So really, when it comes to origins, really it can be blown down to two things, okay? We're either here by design or we're here by chance. Really, it boils down to those two options. Again, I love it when you come to what is called the law of the excluded middle, where you have to, it's one or the other, okay? So, with this, it is one or the other. We're either here by chance or we're here by design, okay? And so when we get into it, is it the Big Bang? Is it God? And we're going to find out that as we ask those questions, we're going to show that there are problems with other questions. Do you have a question, Joe?
So is this kind of like thinking of the first cause, or is that kind of?
Yes.
Yeah.
No, this is the first cause. This is how we have something rather than nothing. Yep. So, and what is it that has that aspect of eternality in it? Okay? And we see scientists today that are doing everything they can, from even Stephen Hawking before he passed away, coming up with something called imaginary time. They want to get the eternal universe. And that's why when we went from what was called the static universe to the expanding universe, okay, it was a big problem because Einstein's theory started showing there had to be an absolute beginning of time, space, matter, and energy. Well, if it began, then it couldn't be that thing which is eternal, which is necessary if there's something rather than nothing, because nothing creates nothing, okay? So origin, and we'll get more into this. Every worldview has to account for why reality exists, okay? The next question that we have is that we need to know meaning. I love, and we'll get into this, Viktor Frankl. He had what they called the logotherapy, or the third Viennese school of psychotherapy. And he basically said when he was in Auschwitz, and he lost all of his family, I think Auschwitz was his third concentration camp. But he said as soon as people lost meaning, they were gone. He said he even came up with an equation, a very simple equation, and it was S minus M equals D. Suffering without meaning always leads to despair. And he said as soon as that meaning was lost, they were gone. Whether it was suicide, whether it was they gave up the will to live. So there seems to be meaning that drives us. You guys, we don't even have to think that far. Just think of your own inner thoughts, your own interactions with yourself or with others. Purpose is, think of people when they claim suicide. A lot of the times, purpose is one of the main reasons. So I do believe. Now, some people will say, well, especially in postmodernism, well, purpose is something we derive on our own. But is that sufficient? Does that answer the question? We'll get more and more into that, but I think they do have to account for the existential feeling that meaning is of utmost importance. Okay, any questions on that? Okay, the third question, morality. We're actually going to do one. I'm going to do a talk, a PowerPoint or a focus point called the characteristics of morality. And we're going to show it. I'm going to do it primarily so that you can see that the characteristics of morality disprove a worldview that everything is made out of matter, that is material, or what we would call naturalism. Okay? Very few people will deny that morality exists. We even have atheist philosophers like Kai Nielsen, who is a Canadian philosopher, who absolutely says morality exists. I can't explain it, but it exists. Okay, we all know it. It's driven. Look at just the recent thing that we're going through. We're not sure the science, and I'm not getting into anything political, but we don't know the science of COVID-19. We're still guessing. It goes back and forth. But the one thing we know for sure, it's wrong for innocent people to die. Now, we're not innocent. Again, we talked about that, but you get my point, I'm assuming. We're actually more sure on the morality of the issue, that we should try to protect life because it's worth protecting, than the scientific knowledge that we have that tells us what the virus is. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay? So even in our life as we see it, we live out a deeper understanding of morality than we do of science a lot of the times. But yet, if you go with certain worldviews, morality is denied. I'll give you a different example from Hinduism. If Hinduism is correct to reality, there is no difference between evil and good because both are manifestations of God. So both Hitler and Mother Teresa are manifestations of God. Okay, so you lose certain things with certain worldviews, but we know that morality exists. An apologist that was at a university setting, and I think I talked about it in here last time, a guy came up in the audience and said, "Who told you morality is true? It's voice." And so he gave the example, what if I brought up a 1-year-old child and cut him up into pieces in front of you? Would that be wrong? And the guy said, well, I can't say that it was wrong, I just wouldn't like it. That's scary. I have a book, it's called The Natural History of Rape. And in that book, now the authors deny, they say now that it's abhorrent, but they do say that rape at one time was a good thing because it allowed the strong to have more offspring. Anything that would say that rape is a good thing makes you worry. But again, that's where we carry. So morality is a question that all have to answer. Is morality here? Is it subjective or objective? Do we have a duty to it? There's a whole area of philosophy called deontology, which is our duty to certain things. Okay? The next one, destiny. What happens when we die? Do we just go back and become worm fodder? You know, does anybody else, the worms crawl in, the worms crawl out, the worms, anybody else know that song? Dude, I must have came from, oh, you do? Okay, good. I was starting to think maybe, you know, who knows? I said it to my middle schoolers and I thought, yeah, but obviously it's not. But destiny, what happens to us when we die? Again, when we're thinking about Pascal's wager or the probability, you know, if I'm wrong, you know, then I return to the dirt and that's the end of it. But if an atheist is wrong, wow, there's eternal ramifications. There's eternal consequences. And like gravity, whether you believe it or not is inconsequential. Reality takes over. That's the way it is. And as we talked about earlier, religious ideas can be validated. We can argue for the truthfulness of what we claim, and we can give, I think, good evidences to show that God exists, that the God of the Bible exists, and what he has told us about the future is sure to happen. Okay? And so, what is the destiny? You have to tell us what happens to us. Okay? And then the last one, I think, is the one that is so hard nowadays. What are we? What is a human? What is our identity? I mean, nowadays, identity is more of a commodity. What are your looks? What are your skills? How smart are you? You know what? There's always someone smarter. There's always someone better. There's always someone more intelligent. But our identity as Christians, if the Christian worldview is true, should be filled with hope. We have so many Christian kids that are in despair, and really because they don't know where their identity lies. Now, I don't deny mental illness, believe me, but for the most part, I think some of it is because their identity has been absorbed from the world. Constant comparison with Facebook and Instagram and all these things. When we are worthy, no matter what state we're in, no matter how intelligent we are, no matter what we look like, no matter how physically able we are of infinite value because of the one who has given his image to us. Okay? But identity, or are you just grown-up pond scum? I mean, really, there's huge difference. Because I have a quote, I don't use it in this class, but I have a quote that basically this scientist is arguing for the use of vegetative humans and those with developmental disabilities to be experimented upon similar to rabbits. Okay? We have people like Peter Singer that is advocating infanticide out of Princeton, basically because of self-identity. It's really not a valuable human until they have self-recognition. Okay? Very interesting ideas, but it's all based on identity. Okay? So where does it lead us? Okay, so when we look at this then, we're going to now look at 5 principles. Now, I'm going to go over these principles briefly. I want you to write them down. We will come back to them and back to them. It's going to be one of those things that through rote repetition, you'll finally get it. You may not get it all to begin with, but I want you to have these principles so that when you are thinking, when you're doing this, and what you're going to do with your surveys is if you do your surveys, then what you're going to do is you're going to try to apply the 5 principles. Now, if you get an article, you can do it otherwise, but I'll give you the surveys at the end of class, okay? So the 5 principles, and again, this is based on Romans 1 and 2. We won't go into depth examining that portion and how each of these things come out of Romans 1 or 2, but read Romans 1 and 2, read the 5 principles, and see if you can correlate the 5 principles to the portion of Paul's letters, or Paul's letter in Romans, okay, 1 and 2. Okay, the book, Finding Truth, all of her books. She actually was a student of Francis Schaeffer. If you're familiar with Francis Schaeffer, she came back to faith at L'Abri. She is a fantastic writer. She has quite a few books out. Total Truth, Finding Truth, Saving Leonardo, very culturally active. Her husband and her put out a cultural newsletter. Someone very much look into her writing. The book isn't that bad. I'd say it's about 350 pages.
I'm sorry, what was her name?
Nancy Pearcey, Pearcey. Actually, if you go into the Zoom, and it was just that day I was doing research into some Nancy Pearcey. All of my Zoom sessions, the password is Nancy Pearcey, I think #1. Yeah. I really enjoy her stuff. And I believe what she did is she took Francis Schaeffer's thoughts, which were great. I love his stuff, which, if you're at all interested, the entire L'Abri library of everything that Francis Schaeffer and those do, it's online. It's free. So you can go out and listen to his discussions. Fascinating stuff to just think through and listen to. I can help anybody find it that needs to. But anyways, so the first principle is identify the idol. As Calvin said, we are idol factories. Okay? And we want to replace. And so this idol, if you want to think of it this way, the idol is what we've replaced as the most important thing in our life. It may be a principle. It may be, and we're going to learn to identify that idol. What is the most important thing to you? Or what do you think is the most important thing? Now, I'm not necessarily talking about making money is the most important thing. If making money is the most important thing, we would really put their idol as the material world. Does that make sense? Okay. Because the material world is what has the highest priority. It is what has replaced God. It is what they evaluate everything else by. Okay? So, after you identify the idol, principle number 2 is identify the idol's reductionism. I know that's a big word, okay? Where we're going to reduce it to its essential aspects. So, say in the case we have somebody that the natural worldview, or the world as it is their idol. That is God. That is what makes everything up, okay? Are we following me? Then the idol's reductionism would be, the material world is made of matter, energy, space, and time. Everything has to be explained with those components. Okay, we've reduced it to its essentials. The atomic world, if you want to say. Okay? We've reduced it to its essentials. Now that we've discovered the idol, we've reduced the idol to its most broken down part, okay, of what creates the world that we have. What are its essential attributes? Does that make sense to everybody? Then what we do is first thing is we test the idol. Does it contradict what we know about the world? So if we follow the explanation where we've gone from a naturalistic idol, or that the universe is all that there is, it is God, okay, in this sense, we reduced it to what makes up the natural world: time, space, matter, and energy. Now we're going to test, does it contradict what we know about the world? Okay, if naturalism is true, what is love? What is that affection that you feel towards your spouse or a friend or, Really, if it has to be explained in time, space, matter, and energy, it is just atoms and chemical reactions that are causing a fatalistic desire to procreate, is what naturalism will say. So the feeling of a love and affection that you have is not what you think it is. It is something totally different. But is that true? Does that explain what we feel towards our? Give you another example. What about numbers? We think of two objects, but two is really an abstract concept. Math is working in abstracts. Two doesn't have a physicality. It's not made of matter. It doesn't occupy space. So if one immaterial thing exists, it disproves materialism. Okay? So we've reduced it, now we're testing it against things that we know in the world. Okay? And this is something that you'll have to work with, because it's not easy all the time. It takes, like practice, like dribbling a basketball, throwing a baseball, hitting, it takes time to become good at it. But really, this 5-step process, I really do believe, when you talk to people, it gives you, and in the book Tactics, it'll help because it gives you the interaction and the communication skills and some ways to be able to move the conversation. But when we test it, that's where we're going to find out their worldview doesn't match reality. If it doesn't match reality, then the likelihood of it being true goes down, especially the more we find. The next one, what we're going to do is test the idol again, but does it contradict itself? Does it violate the law of non-contradiction? Is it a suicidal, as Greg Koch will say in Tactics, is it a suicidal statement? Give you an example of a suicidal statement. It's one that is necessarily false. I don't speak a word of English. It's necessarily false because the claim I made is falsified by how I said it. Are you guys following me? Okay. In philosophy, if something violates, or contradicts itself, it is necessarily false. Okay? So we'll get into this as more of a philosophical notion, okay? The law, or it deals with coherence, law of non-contradiction, and so we will work with that to show when ideas contradict themselves. Give you an example. At the very beginning, we talked about the idea, or we will when we get into the next chapter of I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, is truth. Truth does not exist, okay? Well, when you start denying truth, you end up in a self-contradiction. Truth does not exist. Is that a true statement? If it's true, then it self-destructs. It's necessarily false. It therefore proves that truth is real. Are you guys following me? Okay. Now, I know that makes a lot of people's heads swim, and we'll get more into it. And that is, it's just we're not taught to think anymore. And so a lot of the things that in prior generations would have been learning at this time with logic, I was going for a philosophy degree, and I didn't even have to take a logic class. Okay, so it's interesting. Okay, so test the idol doesn't contradict itself. Now, what we see is we've identified what is the most important, what they think makes the world as it is, that idol, that thing that, because if you think of it this way, God created the world. Their idol has to do the same function. Okay, does that make sense? Then we reduce it to its components so that we can start evaluating if what makes up that idol is capable of creating the world that we have around us. Okay, then we test it first against the world that we know. So everyday experience, that can be historical evidence, that can be philosophical evidence, and it can be all different types of evidences. But it's evaluating it with the world around us. The next one is a true test of just logic, the law of coherence, or if it is coherent. Now in philosophy, if it's incoherent, it's necessarily false. We gave a couple of examples. Okay, so if you have a worldview that fails on both those levels, that's because they've taken the whole of reality, they've reduced it to a portion of reality, and now they're expecting that portion of reality to explain the whole of reality. Do you see the problem? There's going to be inadequacies because now they've reduced, and especially with naturalism, they've taken supernaturalism out. Well, now you no longer can have immaterial objects, but we know they exist. So how does naturalism explain it? It can't, because it shortened the field too much. Is that making sense to everybody? Are we good? So now that we've shown that it's failed, then we do the last step. We replace the idol. We make the case for Christianity. We show that our worldview can answer the deepest questions because it isn't reductionistic. It starts with God, and it starts with the biblical God. And so the questions and the problems that their worldview fails at, ours does not. And so then again, it helps them to see that it matches reality as they understand it. Okay? Does that make sense? So really, we have 5 worldview questions that all worldviews must answer. We have 5 principles that we can use. Now, there's other ways of evaluating worldviews. I love this one. First, I think it's biblical, because I do think that her exposition of Romans 1 and 2 truly brings it out. So I like that. I also think it's easy to remember. You have 5 things. Okay, and you can use those 5 questions and 5 principles. If you become good at it, and tactics, I think really with the asking of questions, you can dismantle most worldviews without even stating what you believe. You can just keep asking questions. Okay, we'll get more into that as we get through the book Tactics and as we look through those things. Okay, so remember, these then apply to these questions: origin, meaning, morality, destiny, and identity. These are some of the areas that we will use to test the worldview. After we have discovered the idol, we've reduced it to what its constituent parts are. Okay? Now we can evaluate it, and we'll show that it fails in multiple areas for most of them, but that Christianity does not. It's true to what they know experientially, scientifically, philosophically about reality. Okay? Which worldview explains the necessary conditions, or at all? Maybe they all fail. Maybe Christianity fails. You guys, I am not saying we don't use this on Christianity. Christianity needs to be able to give an account for all these things. If Christianity is not true, why would you want to believe it? We are searching for truth, and what is true with a capital T. Okay? So let's reason to the best conclusion. God has given us minds. Now, they may not have been used real well over the past, for me, but we can always fine-tune it. Your brain is very amazing. It is what they, for lack of a better term, plastic. You rewire your brain. There's actually a book called The Shallows, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains. It's a fascinating read. It's not too long. It's more dealing with what many kids today, with their activities, how they're rewiring parts of the brain to be able to handle sensory input, especially when it comes to gaming and other things. But you can rewire your brain. You can teach an old dog new tricks. Okay? So we need to be intellectual as well as other portions. So those are the 5 questions and the 5 principles in worldview discussions. So what we're going to do, I'm going to bring it up on the board so I know Pam on Zoom, and if we have anybody else, these are the surveys that I'm going to give out to you. What it is it's a 10-question. Will you give one to everyone, Brian? Or actually, you can give 2 to everyone. You don't have to do this. I know many of you may be terrified of interacting. You can ask. You know, it's really fascinating, not because and we'll get into this with tactics. We should always be looking to bring people to Christ. We're not out there to win battles. We're not there to bludgeon anybody. We're not there to notch our belts to say, we destroyed another argument of one of those atheists. It's not that. We are ambassadors, as we'll learn when in the first chapter of Tactics, we are ambassadors for Christ. So with this, what it is these in different ways address those 5 questions. Okay? But then you can use the 5 principles on the answers to those 10 questions to really start digging into their worldview and being able to practice on how maybe you would do it in a conversation. I'm not asking you to use the 5 principles when you do your interviews. Really what I'm asking you to do on the interviews is get deep into the interviews. Don't let them, as you can see, most of them have open-ended questions. It may start with a specific question, do you believe in God or a transcendent being or whatever, but then it's followed up by, if so, what is it or he or whatever like? Okay? Keep probing. What do you mean by that? Can you give me more variation? Dig in to find out what they believe. Get them to answer all those questions. Then when you come back next week, the second hour, we will talk about how do we use those 5 principles on those questions. How do we show the inadequacies so that we can replace it with Christianity? Okay? Or if you don't want to do surveys, I would also, and again, this is not to say ha ha ha, I think you guys will find it very enlightening to ask Christians these questions. I think you will be surprised. At the beginning of my worldview class at Messiah, I actually give out a book called What's Your Worldview? It's like a choose your own adventure book. Have you guys ever done those? I used to love those. It used to be like, you see a goblin on the tree, you can either jump down the hole or you can run around the backside, and it says go to page 47. Well, in this book, it actually asks you questions. Do you believe in free will? Do you believe in certain things about reality? And then it says, if so, go to this page. If so, go to this page. And at the end, it leads you to one of, I think, 50 worldviews that basically says when the rubber hits the road because of the questions you answered, this is truly what you believe. Okay? I had one year where I had 11 kids in the class and only 2 came back as Christian. And they were raised in Christian families. Okay? Now, I always tell them that doesn't mean you're not a Christian or that you're not saved. It just means you don't really know a lot about what the biblical worldview teaches.
What's the name of the book?
What's Your Worldview? I have a copy of one if you want to, you can get it on Kindle. Yeah, and then it does links, but I have like 20 copies if you want to use a copy and look at it.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah, and so ask these questions or bring articles about one of the 5 topics, origin, meaning, morality, destiny, and identity, okay? And I usually prefer articles from someone who wants to deny them. So say from a Christian worldview, try to find an article in something like The Atlantic or the New York Times or something like that that is someone giving a secular, non-Christian view of one of those 5 topics, okay? I'm very much into source material. I don't like to read what Christians say about atheists usually. I like to read what atheists say about atheists. but it depends on where you are. Sometimes that can be disturbing. So, but we will get into source material. Like I said, we're going to read an atheist book. I would like to, so when we get into the item on abortion, you're actually going to have to come up with an article from someone who supports abortion so that we can look at their support and find out where it goes wrong. Does that make sense? Okay? So that we can learn to think. So that is the survey. So either one is due next week. So we won't have another PowerPoint or we won't have another focus point. Next week we'll just be discussing your surveys the second hour or your articles. Okay? Any questions? Yes?
The S plus M equals D, what does that stand for?
Suffering without meaning equals despair.
S minus M.
Yeah, S minus M equals D. Again, I like concise things. Well, I should say I don't. I like lots of things, but I know concise things are better. So, but I think it's very true. And I'm trying to think of there's two books actually. The first book that he came up, I think it's called The Self-Conscious God. And then the second one is, well, I'll have to get those titles to you. I can't think of off the top of my head if you want to read those. Yep. So, any other questions? Dave?
Is there any kind of, something like a tutorial on how to go through this questionnaire with people available online or on Zoom or anything like that?
I don't, we've started, I don't know if we posted it yet. Brian and I are starting a new podcast, and we've started with these surveys. And actually, the podcast is eventually going to be us discussing surveys that we've gone out and done and how we can further conversations. So it's going to be very niche, but we've gotten through the first 5 questions. Two. Oh, gosh. We got through on how to ask questions, because how to ask questions is very important. But we're starting to get through the questions. So that is available. It's not fully up there yet, so we will let you know when it is. You guys, the syllabus has my number, doesn't it? It has all my contact information. You guys, my students contact me all the time.
What's your email?
Okay, if you have a question, email me. I have no problem. I still have kids that text me for numerous reasons, sometimes to talk, sometimes for answers. I even got one, I had one kid I worked with for an entire year, and every week we met for 2 hours in the morning at Starbucks and we read atheist books together. And I remember I was up at like 12:30, that's my time to read, and I get this text, and he said, "Hi, Mr. Mauser. I'm only texting you because I know you're awake, probably reading something." And he had just been, it was really nice. He said, "I just saw a debate between an atheist and a Christian," and he said, "I realized that I could answer every single question the atheist brought up." And he said, "I thank you." And sometimes you don't hear back, but I left the faith because questions weren't answered. I don't care how old you are or who you are. If you have a question, feel free to contact me. I may not have the answer, but I'm pretty resourceful. I can find the answer. So you guys have in your syllabus, you have what is due next week. If you need any of the books, I've got I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, the hard copy. I do not have Tactics. All of them are on Kindle, though. We did find out last week that I Don't Have Enough Faith, they've taken off as Audible. I have it because I showed that I had it, but you can no longer buy it. I don't know why. But that's the only one, and one is scientific. Any final questions or thoughts?
Would you maybe quickly verbally go through the 4 power questions?
Yeah, if you want to write this down, and we'll actually get to it in slightly different form in Tactics, but there's also another video series that we use. It's older, and I'd love to have it redone, a little more modern, but it's called Simple Tools for Brain Surgery. And it has 4 questions. Really 5 questions when you walk through it. The first question is, what do you mean by that? It's a clarifying question. Okay? So when someone says they believe in God, what do you mean by God? Do you mean like the Jedi God, like the Force, like the little, whatever those things? My son would be so mad because, yay, thank you. He'll be happy. See, hey, it was Joe. So the first one is that. The second one is, how did you come to that conclusion? This is an evidential question. This is asking for their reasoning behind their determination or their conclusion. And you will find out that most people have no clue why they came to that conclusion. Most of it is because we live in a soundbite culture. But this helps reveal people, even if they don't have an answer, all of a sudden they're on the spot and they've said something is true and now they can't back it up. They feel that. There's an internal tension now. So they're going to probably go seek it out. Okay, the third one, what if you're wrong? Okay? It's the so what question. What if you're wrong? Similar to, what are the ramifications? What are the consequences of your belief? Are they your consequences? Well, if you believe that, this is true, then we make up our morality, and I really don't like you, so I'm going to off you, and might makes right. Okay? And the fourth question is, oh gosh, Brian, it just left me.
What difference?
What difference does it make? Yeah. What if you're wrong? What difference does it make? That's the what difference does it make is more of the ramification. And then the final one is, what will convince you? Basically, is the what will convince you question. It's basically, what will you accept as proof? Okay? This is where we start getting into the questions, because if you have someone that only will accept 5 million people, then it's like, well, dude, I guess the discussion's over because I can't prove anything to you. I can't even prove I exist because there's not 5 million people here viewing me. So, if we can't even start with that, then we have no common ground. Okay? So those are the questions that when you ask your surveys, dig into those. So if they say, I believe in God, what do you mean by that? Oh, I believe, there is Jediism, and there's like 115,000 of them in Great Britain. So maybe they're Jediism. And they say, well, I'm a Jedi. Well, how'd you come to the conclusion that the Force is what's true to reality? Oh, well, what if you're wrong? Okay, you use those just 4 simple questions. You can use them in different ways. You don't always say, how'd you come to that conclusion? How'd you come to that conclusion? What made you think that was true? So you can vary it a little. But use those 4 questions on those 5 topics, and then we're going to show how we can evaluate them with the 5 principles. Does that sound good? Cool. Any other questions? Okay, cool. We'll close it for tonight. I highly recommend. It is much better. And I'm not blaming anybody because you guys weren't even here. But it should be able to. It's usually only maybe 30 to 40 pages a week that you read. Break it up if you need to. I don't know. I'm a faster reader, but I know not many people are. So just try to break it up. And then the Bible, 1 chapter a day. It's just so that we get into the Word, and hopefully you're all into the Word anyways, but that takes maybe 3 to 7 minutes. Not real big, just 1 chapter. And then bring those questions. Make sure you're marking in your book so that you have questions. Prod it, poke it, try to prove it wrong. Okay? Thank you, guys. Why don't we just end with a quick prayer? Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, I thank you for our time together. Lord, I thank you that you have paved the way from so many before that have helped us to understand our faith and have been ambassadors for you. Lord, I pray that you would just strengthen us in our understanding of who you are. You would help us to grow in our faith. You would give us wisdom and discernment. Lord, I pray that you would be with everybody here as they go home. And Lord, be with them as they do their activities during the week and as they seek to understand and to know their faith. So Lord, we thank you. We thank you for the salvation that you've given us. And in your Son's name we pray. Amen.